Should Christians learn about Islam? Let's say you're like me and you're a Bible guy. Why should we care about what's in the Quran? Well, David Wood has dedicated much of his adult life to answering those questions. David, my brother, welcome to Can I Trust the Bible?
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing good, buddy. So let's just get right after it. Why, and I know you're really passionate about this subject, why should Christians even care about Islam?
There are multiple reasons. One, as you pointed out, you're dealing with nearly 2 billion Muslims in the world. And so you're talking about basically a quarter of the world's population are Muslim. And this is one of the reasons that I stayed involved in this, because I got involved in this just because my best friend in college was a Muslim. After he became a Christian a few years later, I actually thought to myself, oh, cool, I'm done with Islam. And didn't get away from it, because I sort of realized back then I was more interested in the objections of atheists, but so were almost all apologists. Almost all Christian apologists were going after atheism. And I was just sitting there thinking, gosh, there are so many Muslims in the world. Why aren't we dedicating more of our apologists to dealing with this? And so I realized, like, hey, even though I'm more interested in this is kind of, there's a bigger need over here. So that's one. Another is, I get this a lot from, not as much as I used to, but you know, you go back 10 years ago when I was trying to tell people that they need to learn about Islam for their conversations with Muslims and so on. And people are saying, no, I don't need to learn about their stuff. What I have is superior to theirs. But you have a lot of Muslim preachers and what are called da'is. These are the people, these are like their version of evangelists, but people who invite others to Islam. They'll pick up on whatever is most important or valuable to people, and they'll make up a story about how Islam is the source of that thing. And so in other words, matter of fact, you can see this in real time. If you go back to the 1960s, when Islam was spreading in the African-American community with the help of people like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and so on, the message back then was, hey, how can you guys believe in Christianity? That's a religion that enslaves people. Islam liberates people and treats all people equally. Muhammad freed all the slaves. And people believed that. People believed that message. It was completely false. It was completely false. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, bought, owned, sold, and traded black African slaves. The Muslim community was the one that institutionalized the African slave trade centuries before the United States even existed. But think about this. When the preacher comes and says, hey, here's what's important to you, let me tell you, that's why you need Islam. If no one's in a position to raise his hand and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not true. What you're saying about Islam is not true. What you're saying about Muhammad is not true. This happens over and over again. If it's an area where they love science, then the Quran is a fountain of scientific learning and so on that contains scientific insights that couldn't possibly have been known by Muhammad. They must come from God. If you believe in women's rights, Muhammad was probably the greatest feminist who ever lived. And so you have these dawah guys, and they'll preach Islam, and they are all too happy to say whatever they think will help that person convert to Islam. And if no one knows any better, no one is in a position to correct any of this stuff. And so there's that you're kind of, one of the biggest advantages the Muslim da'i has is people's ignorance, because it allows him to say whatever he wants and to convince people that Islam is true. And so that doesn't change until people learn enough about Islam to raise their hand and say, what you just said about Islam and women is not true. And so those are a couple reasons I could include more. One more important one is that Muslims make really cool Christians,
as evidenced by Nabil Qureshi.
Yeah, and matter of fact, that was where I saw it. I was watching. Wow, he's taking a much firmer stand than a lot of people who convert. And after a while, I kind of figured out the reasons in discussions with Nabil. But the reason lots of Muslims make really, really awesome, powerful Christians is it's connected to some of the features that keep people from ever leaving Islam. So a Muslim is basically raised all of his life to believe that the worst possible sin is the sin of shirk, associating a partner with Allah. So if you say Jesus is Lord, which is required by the gospel, if you say Jesus is Lord, according to Islam, that's the unpardonable sin. That's a one-way ticket to hell. So they're taught their entire lives that saying Jesus is Lord is the worst thing you can possibly do. They typically know that the penalty for leaving Islam officially is death. Most Muslims would say you don't apply it in a non-Muslim country, but they understand that if someone ever wants to carry out that penalty, that, you know, they could run the risk of getting their heads chopped off. And at the very least, even if no one's going to chop their head off, Muslims typically have to give up their family. Like their family either tries to win them back, and if it doesn't work, there's just a strained relationship, or they say, leave, don't ever come back here until you're a Muslim again. But they understand they're giving up their entire social framework if they convert to Christianity. So anyway, the point is there's these massive psychological barriers in the way of Muslims accepting the gospel. This will get you sent to hell. This will get your head chopped off. And at the very least, you have to give up your family.
Wow.
But there's a positive side to that. The positive side is that when a Muslim says, you know what, I may have to give up my family, and I may have to give up my life, and I've been told all my life that this is the worst thing I could possibly do and that this will get me sent to hell. But you know what? I want to know Jesus anyway.
Wow.
That's someone who will lay down his life for Jesus, right? He's already been willing to give up everything else. Ooh. And so that's why you're not going to be able to shake that person later on.
Wow, that is so insightful, my brother. Now, I want to get into more details of the Quran and what the Islamic faith actually teaches, but I want to ask you this question. You know, even before we got started, you're like, hey, don't share where I live, because at the end of the day, like, you are touching on a very landminey subject, which is the idea of confronting what Islam teaches. And I've watched a ton of your videos over the years, and what you don't find often, you do find people calling you all sorts of names and threats, all this stuff, but you don't necessarily find a lot of people dissecting what you said about Islam, in the sense that you're just quoting surah this, whatever, this is what it says in the hadiths, this is what Muhammad's life looked like in the hadiths. You're quoting Islamic tradition and then expanding on it. So my question is, why are you doing this? In the sense that, like, you can't be just a normal dude who goes about their day and doesn't think about the fact that you are, for lack of a better words, poking in the hornet's nest. You're doing it. A lot of people, most people, almost all people, even Bible believers, would be kind of terrified simply to resuscitate what the hadith and the Quran say, but you do it openly, brazenly on YouTube. Why do you, David Wood, do what you do?
I believe in, like, divine purpose behind where we are in history right now. That so if you go back like 20 years, we were getting the statistics on just population growth rates in the Muslim world, and Muslims had the fastest growth rate, not from conversions, but from just high birth rates in Muslim countries. And so they were predicting that, you know, by the year 2050, this European nation is going to be Muslim majority. By 2060, this European nation is going to be Muslim majority, and so on. And it was presented as this is all just straightforward math. And so it was looking like, oh, this is really, it's inevitable. It's inevitable. And I look at that, and at the same time this is about to happen, at the same time we're being told Islam is inevitably going to take over large sections of Europe and so on. All of a sudden, at that exact same time, for the first time in history, we get open access to Muslim sources. When I talk about back in the 1960s, if a Muslim preacher was making things up and how Muhammad liberated all the slaves and so on, how would a person in the 1960s be able to even respond to that? You have to have the hadiths. They hadn't even been translated yet. You didn't have access to them. No one was in a position to refute something that's being made up. All of a sudden, in the 1980s and 1990s, we start getting their sources translated and so on. And now we all have open access to it. And you could get open access to all their main sources online. So we're the first generation that's in a position to respond to things that are being made up to make Islam sound really good. So we're that first generation. We're also the first generation that gets open access to Muslims around the world. I mean, for 14 centuries, Muslim leaders have been able to keep their people pretty insulated, right? A Muslim would spend his entire life without ever hearing Islam criticized. He'd spend his entire life without hearing a serious presentation of the gospel. And if you wanted to reach Muslims with the gospel, you had to go to a Muslim country, and you had a pretty good chance of getting your head chopped off if you were at all successful. Whereas now, I mean, we're in a time where I could right now, while we're sitting here, if I wanted to, I could grab my phone and start talking to a Muslim in Saudi Arabia on Facebook or something, right? So that's something that's massively changed, that now Muslim leaders cannot keep their people completely insulated and isolated. We have open access to Muslims in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Iran and so on. So I look at this and I say, we're the first generation that has open access to their sources, open access to Muslims around the world. We got Muslims who've come here, and yet we're told that, oh, inevitably in 5 or 6 decades, Islam takes over. And I'm thinking, wait, we just got everything we need to reach Muslims with the gospel around the world right now? Right when we're told it's inevitable? I look at this and I go, my goodness, the Lord has delivered that ideology into our hands.
Wow.
So I look at this as like really good times. And as far as criticizing Islam, that was something that I saw with Nabil, because I mean, we were having discussions for about 4 years. And for the first like 2.5 of those, we focused almost entirely on Christian topics: the death of Jesus, the resurrection, Jesus as Son of God, the Trinity, the reliability of the New Testament. We were focused on studying those issues. Eventually, he was giving me arguments for Islam that forced me to actually go look up what's in the Muslim sources. So he's talking about scientific miracles of Muhammad's claims in the hadiths and so on. So I would go out and buy these collections. I would buy these collections so I could look up the passage. And then I would look up the passage and I would go, whoa, that's not what it says. That's not what it says. But I would keep reading and I would go, hey, look at this. This is completely wrong. And this is some really messed up stuff. And I would go back to him and I would say, hey, you pointed this out. Keep in mind, he wasn't being deceptive. He had read this in like an Muslim apologetics book, or heard this from a Muslim speaker or something like that. But I would actually look it up, and then I was able to go back to him and say, hey, you know, you said that Muhammad said this and that it's miraculous. Let's go ahead and read this a little more carefully. And oh, let's read a couple passages later. Look at this. This is really, really bad stuff here. And he didn't tell me until after he became a Christian, but he said, when we were discussing Christian topics, the death of Jesus, the resurrection, and so on, he thought to himself, when we were discussing Christian topics, Christians actually have really good reasons for believing what they believe. He said, Christians have a case for everything they believe. They have good reasons for all of these things. He said, but he thought to himself, even if they showed me with 99% certainty that all these things are true, I'm still 100% sure that Islam is true, because of the scientific miracles and because of the miraculous preservation of the Quran, and because he would go down the list, right? So he thought that he had all these airtight arguments and that this gave him 100% confidence in Islam. He said it wasn't until we challenged Islam and we started going through Islamic beliefs about Muhammad and the Quran, and he saw problems where he didn't know there were any, and he saw that the arguments weren't as good as he thought, that doubting Islam and at least not having that 100% confidence is what allowed him to take the gospel more seriously. And so that's just been my experience. It's not always, but most of the time, the vast majority of the time, I would say, like in my experience, like 90 to 95% of the time, when a Muslim leaves Islam and becomes a Christian, it's only after someone showed him some serious problems with Islam. And so I'm just saying this because I've had Christians saying, no, just preach the gospel. Don't point out the problems with Islam. Well, you're preaching the gospel and he thinks he's 100% confident in Islam because of he's been built upon this foundation of just making things up. Why would you not want to expose those? And so he can actually take what you're saying seriously. So yeah, that's why it was just Nabil. I realized how important it was back then to be criticizing this stuff. And so I realized, hey, it's not just him. The rest of the Muslim world, they all need to hear this too.
That is so insightful. Now, for those of you who don't know, Nabil Qureshi was brought to the Lord basically by David, and he wrote a book, really famous book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. I think it's brilliant. I've read it. It's a very easy, understandable read. So if you want to, I couldn't recommend that book enough.